Welcome to LOA Live. For those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit publisher and cultural institution dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture for readers and writers to discover and rediscover. We're grateful to our partners this evening, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard, the American Writers Museum in Chicago, the University of Houston, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, home to James Baldwin's personal archive. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our mission. In times of great crisis, our greatest writing speaks to us with new profundity. Deep calls unto deep, as the psalmist says. As the momentous events of the past weeks have unfolded, the prophetic power of James Baldwin's voice and his searching explorations of race and America's unfulfilled promise have never been more illuminating or more necessary. This evening's event inaugurates Reading James Baldwin Now, a series of engagements with Baldwin's work led by gifted scholars, writers, and teachers. Our focus tonight is Baldwin's story, Sonny's Blues, published in 1957. Our guest is Farah Jasmine Griffin, Chair of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. Sonny's Blues can be found in Library of America series volume number 97, Baldwin's Early Novels and Stories, edited by Toni Morrison, one of 3 LOA volumes collecting Baldwin's essays and fiction. Music and the people who make it are central to Baldwin's work. This story of a jazz pianist's struggles with his art and his addiction resonates deeply with a well-known passage in the 1951 essay, Many Thousands Gone. Baldwin writes, "It is only in his music, which Americans are able to admire because a protective sentimentality limits their understanding of it, that the Negro in America has been able to tell his story. It is a story which otherwise has yet to be told and which no American is prepared to hear." To talk about Baldwin and Sonny's Blues, we're incredibly fortunate to have with us Farah Jasmine Griffin, William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature and African American Studies at Columbia, and director of its Institute for Research in African American Studies. Farah's books include Who Set You Flowin', The African American Migration Narrative, If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, In Search of Billie Holiday, and most recently, Harlem Nocturne, Women Artists and Progressive Politics During World War II. She is editor of a volume of Ann Petrie's novels in the Library of America series. Her essays and articles have appeared in Essence, the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, and elsewhere. She collaborated with pianist Jerry Allen and actor S. Epatha Murkerson on 2 theater projects celebrating great women jazz artists. Farah will talk for about 30 minutes, then invite your questions, comments, and observations. You can submit a question or comment at any time using the Q&A button on your menu bar. If you wish, please let us know where you're viewing from. Now, please welcome Farah Jasmine Griffin.
Good evening. Thank you, Max. Thank you also to this evening's partners, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is one of my favorite places, my second institutional home. And as Max said, the home of Baldwin's remarkable archive, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard, the American Writers Museum in Chicago, the University of Houston, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers. But most especially, I want to thank those of you, all of you, who have chosen to spend this evening reading and thinking about one of the world's most important writers, James Baldwin. Baldwin is one of our most prescient and prophetic voices. We learn so much by returning to him because he still informs, teaches, enlightens, and inspires us. I know that I am not alone when I say that reading his work made me want to pursue essay writing as a means of expressing my own thoughts, ideas, fears, and concerns. Two of today's most prominent writers and commentators, Ta-Nehisi Coates and Eddie Glaude, also credit his importance to their own writing. And if I'm not mistaken, Professor Henry Louis Gates of Harvard has also credited Baldwin as a formative influence on his own aspirations as a writer. We are now living in the midst of a Baldwin revival, and never did we need him more. Raoul Peck's 2016 film, I Am Not Your Negro, brought him to a new generation and provided a deep context for those newly made curious by the numerous Baldwin quotations that find their way on social media and seem to speak directly to our time. Through his own editing and writing projects, the literary critic and theorist Rich Blint oversees a number of research projects and curatorial projects using new theoretical methodologies to bring us fresh and exciting new readings of Baldwin's work. James Baldwin's powerful nonfiction essays, his Jeremiads, as Harold Bloom has called them, have rightly earned him the place as an American prophet. It is this Baldwin that we are most often hearing from in this time. This Baldwin who we are engaging most. This Baldwin, the writer of those powerful nonfiction essays collected in one of the 3 Library of American volumes devoted to his work that seem to speak most to us at this time. In fact, the volume of his collected essays was among the first Library of America volumes that I actually purchased on my own and marked the start of my collection of Library of America volumes, which fill my bookshelf now. That it was edited by Toni Morrison and then later by Darrell Pinckney, 2 of my favorite writers, made it even more special. But for tonight, I want to turn away from Baldwin's nonfiction and return to Baldwin, the writer of fiction. Although he is without question a highly accomplished essayist and orator, let us not forget that he was also a very gifted fiction writer. And it is in his fiction, his imaginative writing, where he reveals the deep complexity, beauty, and pain of what it means to be Black in America. In fact, what it means to be human in the world. This past semester, my students came to greatly respect Baldwin through reading the essays of The Fire Next Time. But after encountering Sonny's Blues, some of them came to love him. Before turning to the story, allow me to share a little background about Baldwin for those in our audience who might not be familiar with him. Baldwin was born on August 2nd, 1924. He was educated in New York City public schools, and he famously says that he read every volume in the County Cullen Harlem branch of the New York Public Library. At age 14, he became a precocious boy preacher following in the steps of his stepfather, but he soon grew disillusioned with the Pentecostal church of his youth. At age 15, he met the modernist painter Buford Delaney in Greenwich Village. Delaney became an artistic mentor and helped Baldwin find his own way as an artist. Many say that Delaney is actually the model for the character Creole in Sonny's Blues. At age 24, Baldwin left the United States for Paris, and while in Europe, he completed his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, published in 1953, which immediately announced him as a young writer of serious importance. He would write several other novels, collections of essays, and plays. His most famous collection of essays are the 2 that make up The Fire Next Time, which was published in 1963. After returning to the United States, Baldwin became one of the major figures speaking on behalf of the civil rights movement and working closely with Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers. He continued to write even after his profound disillusionment following the assassinations of Evers. King, and Malcolm X. Toward the end of his life, he taught college students in Massachusetts, and he would go on to publish at least 5 more novels, several more collections of essays, as well as plays and screenplays. He died in France on December 1st, 1987. Sonny's Blues, the story that we're reading tonight, first appeared in the Partisan Review in 1957. It was later republished in Baldwin's short story collection, Going to Meet the Man, in 1965. Told in 8 sections, Sonny's Blues is the story of a jazz musician for whom the story is named, a former heroin addict recently released from prison. The story is told from the point of view of his older brother, the unnamed narrator, a Harlem resident, a husband and father, an algebra teacher. The story is so well constructed, as is necessary for the very best short stories. It is very tightly woven with a kind of literary economy that makes the most of the form of the short story. Sonny's Blues is often described as a jazz story, and certainly it is in many ways, especially in the depiction of the ritual of the jazz performance with which the story ends. I have always been drawn to the story for the reasons that often draw me to Baldwin: its portrayal of the difficult, its willingness to confront the darkness, to acknowledge how closely we live at the edge of the abyss, to remind us, as all great literature does, that we all suffer, that it is the lot of the human to suffer. And in spite of this, or perhaps because of this, the stories always have a commitment to love, to hard-won understanding, and to the grace of redemption. Specific to this story, I also cherish the way that Baldwin deals with the character struggling with addiction. He offers a compassionate portrait. Sonny has greater sensitivity and spiritual depth than does his more respectable brother. When teaching the story, I remind my students that at the time of its publication in 1957, drug addicts, especially Black drug addicts, were shown no compassion, were hunted and arrested, treated poorly. From the 1950s to the 1970s, heroin ravaged poor and working class Black communities. Musicians were especially hard hit. These were the days before Narcan and safe spaces and call for humane care for addicts. These were the days before the face of opioid addiction was young white addicts. In those days, addicts were hunted, arrested, stigmatized. I'm going to call for slide 1 and 2. Consider Billie Holiday here in a mugshot from 1947, harassed and targeted by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics under the order of Harry Anslinger, who had been hunting her since 1939. Next slide. Here she is, coming to court for an arraignment. In fact, she was arrested and handcuffed even on her deathbed. Similarly, Charlie Parker, Sonny's idol, was also an addict. But Sonny, like Holiday, is unapologetic about his addiction. He is neither self-pitying nor sentimental. Thank you. There are many important images, symbols, and themes in this story that are worthy of our attention. We won't have time to go through all of them, but among them, there's darkness and light. There's the imagery of veins filled with ice, as the brother says his are, or filled with heroin, or toward the end, filled with royal blood. There's a theme of family, of brothers especially, that runs throughout much of Baldwin's fiction. And for our purposes, the theme of listening. We will touch upon all of these, but the latter, listening, is the one thread I'd like us to follow, particularly listening as it relates to storytelling. The story's title, Sonny's Blues, signals notions of listening and storytelling. Is the title a gesture toward Sonny's misery? Toward the kind of music he plays? Toward song? I want to suggest that it gestures towards all of these and his triumph, however momentarily, in sharing his story, in sharing his blues, and in doing so, freeing us to tell ours. Recall the story's opening section, when the brother, the unnamed narrator, meets a character simply called the boy, a friend of Sonny's on the street who has come to tell the brother that Sonny has been arrested. This friend is also an addict. The brother holds him with disdain and contempt, and he says to him, "Look, don't tell me your story. If it was up to me, I'd give you one." Then he says to himself, "Then I felt guilty. Guilty probably for never having supposed that the poor bastard had a story of his own, much less a sad one." Early here, he sees forlorn adults, and the way that he can remember to keep a sense of compassion for them is to think about them as children, to return to their beginning, to see the child in the addict or the young woman who he calls a whore, who's a barmaid. He returns to the child self in order to touch upon their humanity. And without doing that, without that reminder, he doesn't see them as people with worthy stories to tell. Next slide, please. Now, I chose this quotation largely because it's so beautiful, and it's a moment in the story that returns to the childhood of the narrator and of Sonny. And it's talking about a gathering in the home of their parents after church, when families come over and there's filled with love and fun, and the adults are telling stories. And bear with me, it's a rather long paragraph, 2 paragraphs, but worth listening to. For a minute, these are the adults, forgotten the children. Maybe a kid is lying on the rug half asleep. Maybe somebody's got a kid in his lap and is absent-mindedly stroking the kid's head. Maybe there's a kid, quiet and big-eyed, curled up in a big chair in the corner. The silence, the darkness coming, the darkness in the faces, frightens the child obscurely. He hopes that the hand which strokes his forehead will never stop, will never die. He hopes that there will never come a time when the old folks won't be sitting around the living room talking about where they've come from and what they've seen and what's happened to them and their kinfolks. But something deep and watchful in the child knows that this is bound to end, is already ending. In a moment, someone will get up and turn on the light. Then the old folks will remember the children and they won't talk anymore that day. And when the light fills the room, the child is filled with darkness. The child knows that they won't talk anymore, because if he knows too much about what's happened to them, he'll know too much too soon about what's going to happen to him. This is Baldwin at his best. First, just creating that context, that scene for us in the small room with the adults and the children, giving us that sense of security that children have. In this instance, they're children who are secure in that moment because they know, even in their innocence, they know that there is a kind of darkness and despair that's waiting for them, waiting outside for them. And there's just the tender moments of affection, of someone absent-mindedly stroking the kid's head, and then the child hoping that the hand that strokes his forehead will never stop, hoping that that gesture of love and care will never stop, will never die, hoping that there'll never come a time when the old folks won't be sitting around the living room, sitting around in a protective circle, protecting him from what's outside. And then there's that distinction as the lights come on, the child gets filled with darkness. It's as if the light comes on and exposes something. It ends that moment of intimacy. And the child, not fully knowing exactly what it is that he or she dreads, is fearful. The child knows that the adults won't talk anymore because the stories that they have to tell are just too overwhelming. The stories of what happened to them are too overwhelming. And what they want to do is they want to protect him from what's going to happen to him. Throughout the story, the narrator has to learn to listen, has to learn to have the same compassion for others, adults, his brother included, that we see here with the child. Sonny already has a gift of listening. Later, when he tries to explain to his brother his desire to become a musician, the brother doesn't truly listen. He pretends to, but he already has preconceived notions and pre-drawn conclusions. He says, I couldn't see why on earth he'd want to hang around nightclubs, clowning around on bandstands while people pushed each other around a dance floor. When this, in fact, is the farthest thing from what Sonny wants to do and be. In contrast to the brother, Sonny hones his listening skills. He buys records, he listens to them over and over. He listens to one chord, one change, one progression over and over before trying to learn how to play it. It's a discipline he acquires that will allow him eventually to tell his own story, that will allow him to gain control over the chaos. A skill for enlightened members of the audience who also learn to listen, for in their listening lay the possibility of transformation. Let's turn now to the story's turning point, the revival. Slide, please. Baldwin describes a small Harlem crowd drawn to street performers having a street revival. A woman singing, another with tambourine, both keeping time but collecting money, a man. And as the woman sings a spiritual, the narrator recalls, he notices, not a soul under the sound of their voices was hearing this song for the first time. Not one of them had been rescued, nor had they seen much in the way of rescue work being done around them. Neither did they especially believe in the holiness of the three sisters and the brother. They knew too much about them, knew where they lived and how. The woman with the tambourine, whose voice dominated the air, whose face was bright with joy, was divided by very little from the woman who stood watching her, a cigarette between her heavy, chapped lips, her hair a cuckoo's nest, her face scarred and swollen from many beatings, and her black eyes glittering like coal. Perhaps they both knew this, which was why, when as rarely they addressed each other as sister. None of the people in this scene are sentimental or naive. They hear something in the song beyond the lyrics. They hear it in the sound of the woman's voice. They are all of one community, of one people. The saints know the sinners are holy, and the street folk know the saints are sinners. The woman singing, what is her story, really? Perhaps she is struggling herself with the pull of the street. Perhaps she has not been rescued from the street by the church. And that final line, when as rarely they addressed each other as sister. It's a classic Baldwin. Called each other sister. These are people. The boundaries between sacred and secular, good and bad, are blurred. These women recognize each other in themselves. There is recognition, there is love, the possibility of redemption in a shared look that says simply, I see you. Next slide, please. As the singing filled the air, the watching, listening faces underwent a change, the eyes focusing on something within. The music seemed to soothe a poison out of them, and time seemed nearly to fall away from the sullen, belligerent, battered faces as though they were fleeing back to their first condition while dreaming of their last. This is what the music accomplishes for them. It's what the music does. It helps them. It heals them. It soothes them. It allows them to start again, to dream, to make it through. Eddie Glaude's new book, Begin Again, takes its title from another Baldwin work just above my head, where Baldwin writes, "Not everything is lost. Responsibility cannot be lost. It can only be abdicated. If one refuses abdication, one begins again." For Glaude, Baldwin is saying that our nation must re-examine the fundamental values, commitments that shape our self-understanding. Here, I think Baldwin is saying the same thing about these people, that the music allows them to go back to the beginning, their beginning, the beginning of time, perhaps to remember that moment when they were children sitting in that room and felt a sense of safety, not yet having given in to the despair of the street of America. Sonny listens closely. He hears, he sees, he offers a token of gratitude, a token that's almost like a prayer. Baldwin says, Sonny drops some change in the plate, looking directly at the woman with a smile. Just like the other woman, the street woman, looked at her, Sonny looks at her as well, makes that connection, smiles, thanks her, he connects with her. The music of the revival opens up the narrative. It opens up Sonny. It allows him to begin to tell his story or to try to tell his story. Next slide, please. When she was singing before, her voice reminded me for a minute of what heroin feels like sometimes when it's in your veins. It makes you feel sort of warm and cool at the same time, and distant. And sure, it makes you feel in control. Sometimes you've got to have that feeling. The Black woman's voice, the Black woman's singing voice, creates a possibility for Sonny to encounter himself, to encounter his own longing, and then to try to share it, to try to verbally explain to his brother, this is why I used heroin. This is what I was trying to accomplish by doing so. If earlier in the story, the brother felt ice in his veins, maybe the need to feel warmth or even coolness will help him empathize with Sonny. He finally says to himself, I should listen. Sonny continues. Next slide, please. While I was downstairs before on my way here listening to that woman sing, it struck me all of a sudden how much suffering she must have had to go through to sing like that. It's repulsive to think you have to suffer that much. That what Sonny hears in that song is the woman's tale of suffering that she then turns into her song and offers as an offering, as a gift to others, as a way of bearing witness that I've been through the fire. I know what it's like. I've seen the other side. You can too, perhaps that's what she's saying. In the club, when we get there, Sonny invites his brother to come listen. When finally we get there in the Greenwich Village and Sonny is greeted like a returning hero, Creole tells the brother that Sonny's blood, his veins bear royal blood, right? Here, Sonny is family. He's got a family. He's also recognized for his own royalty. We can think of names like Duke and Prez and Lady, Empress of the Blues, royalty and earned royalty. Creole hears Sonny. Creole guides Sonny in the moment of performance. And the brother, finally listening, can hear himself and learns what actually happens on that bandstand isn't what he thought it was when Sonny first told him about his aspirations. Next slide, please. He says, but the man who creates the music is hearing something else, is dealing with the roar rising from the void and imposing order on it as it hits the air. What is evoked in him then is of another order, more terrible because it has no words, and triumphs, it is ours. I think this statement is true of art, of the artist, of Baldwin himself, who has heard something else, seen something else, the roar rising from the void. And then through the process of creating this work, or many of the works that he's created, or the jazz musician in the process of creating the solo, imposes order on that chaos, on that darkness of the abyss, to create something new, to give it some sense of control. If heroin gives one a feeling of control, then being able to construct a story, to narrate a story through one's improvisation, is to also give one a sense of control over the chaos. The narrator tells us Creole was listening to everything, but he was listening to Sonny. He was having a dialogue with Sonny. He wanted Sonny to leave the shoreline and strike out for the deep water. He was Sonny's witness that that deep water and drowning were not the same thing. He had been there and he knew, and he wanted Sonny to know. He was waiting for Sonny to do things on the keys which would let Creole know that Sonny was in the water. Slide, please. With Creole's loving encouragement, with his listening, his hearing, his urging, his inviting, Sonny moves deep within and tentatively, fearfully goes out. He's tentative. He might come back unsure, uncertain, afraid that he's going to drown. But Creole throws him a lifeline. Creole chooses a blues. He chooses music which provides the basis for all that will follow. He takes him back to the roots of this music that has given birth to so many other musical forms, music born in the early days of Black freedom in the United States. Creole stepped forward to remind them that they were playing the blues. And at that moment, all the musicians and the narrator himself find a place deep within. Let's sit with this quotation. Creole began to tell us what the blues were all about. They were not about anything new. He and his boys up there were keeping it new at the risk of ruin, destruction, madness, and death in order to find new ways to make us listen. For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we triumph is never new, it always must be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. I think this quotation speaks to art throughout time, speaks to the myriad of ways that we've sought to tell the same story of human suffering, desire, delight, redemption. It speaks to this moment in which we are reading it. Black suffering in this country is not new. The movements we've created to alleviate it are part of a continuum, a long Black freedom struggle. The young people in the streets are risking everything, including death and ruin, in order to make us listen and hopefully change. In the club, the musicians surround Sonny. They are a family. They create a net, a lifeline. They support him as he goes back to his beginning. And as he creates order and beauty out of chaos, he tells his story. He confronts his fear and goes there anyway. He finds his voice. He tells his blues. As with the song Billy's Blues, a song named for the performer means that the performer has taken that form, that basic form, the blues, even taken lyrics from other performers and licks, and reconstructed them through their own voice to tell their own unique story. And in telling it, heal themselves and the audience that listens. Albert Murray has taught us that way of listening to the blues. And when they do it well, when they do it in a way that is identifiable, that those of us who listen closely can hear them and their unique voice, that song becomes a part of a canon that other musicians will play. Billy's Blues, Sonny's Blues. The brother finally gets it. He understands the moment of performance as a moment when, he says, next slide, please, freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us be free if we would listen. Help us be free if we would listen, that he would never be free until we did. Following the improvising musician frees us, and our listening to him frees him. It's a mutual relationship between artist and audience, a mutual obligation and responsibility, in fact. It might also be the relationship between a nation and those whose suffering it has caused. What would it mean to truly listen to the immigrant child in detention camps, to Native Americans, to Black Americans? What reckoning might there be for all of us? Learning how to listen, a personal twist on an old story. The great jazz vocalist, lyricist, and composer Abby Lincoln, heir to Billie Holiday, wrote a tune titled Learning How to Listen. I think it resonates with Baldwin. She sings, I'm learning how to listen, how to holler, sing the blues. I'm learning how to rise above and wear somebody's shoes. Learning how to listen, for the song was given me. I'm learning how to listen and be free. I'm learning how to listen, how to hear a melody, how to hear the song I'm singing, how to feel and let it be, how to listen to the song, knowing how it goes, and listen for the melody that flows, and listen for the melody that flows. Baldwin, like Sonny, and like Sonny's brother, at the end of the story, knew how to listen. He listened closely to the sound, the cries, the shouts, the hollers of his people throughout history, and in his own time, he bore witness to them with eloquence and conviction, and then he shared those stories, hoping we would listen to, and in the process, perhaps approach something, come closer to something that looks like freedom. Thank you. I'll end there and open it up so we can talk.
Thanks, Farah.
Thank you, Max.
That was beautiful. Yeah, I encourage our audience to use the Q&A button and ask questions and make comments. And I guess, I'll lead off. I was actually going to refer to that sentence about freedom that you just alluded to or read. And, we had, Juneteenth last week and the 4th of July next week. And the question of freedom and unfreedom are very much on everybody's minds at the moment. And clearly they're also at the center of this story. I mean, the question of what it means to be free versus what it means to escape and maybe not be free. Addiction, which is a form of unfreedom, and yet seems like maybe a form of escape from some other kind of unfreedom. I just wanted you to reflect, to talk about that, and like what kind of, in this passage where he says that freedom was all around us when Sonny is playing. What kind of freedom are we talking about? I mean, in this story about the struggle for freedom and the difficulty of unfreedom, of the various kinds of unfreedom. What kind of freedom is it that Sonny's, that moment offers the characters and us, I guess?
I think it's, it's a particular reading also of performance, right? That in the moment of performance, as ephemeral as it is, that particularly the jazz musician, but not only the jazz musician, gives us a glimpse into what freedom might feel like, where one is free to be oneself, to become the best that one is capable of becoming, where one is unfettered, right? Where, one of my grandmother's favorite, my favorite phrase of my grandmother's is she would say, "Let that baby be." And I think about that, like, what would it mean to just let people be? Like, stop being homophobic, stop being transphobic. Just in that moment, allow them to be and imagine what they might accomplish, which is what we witnessed Sonny doing, right? Confronting his fear, feeling safe enough to really express himself without being fettered. And that the moment of performance gives us, even in that revival, right, gives us a glimpse, a slight moment of this is what we're fighting for. This is what we're struggling for, right? That we have to imagine it. And so that's what I think is the freedom of that moment.
Thank you. I mean, a related question. Well, I'm fascinated by the character of the brother, and I think the question comes up in the story, like it's clearly a story about salvation, or at least momentary salvation. And the question is, whose salvation is at stake? Is it Sonny or the brother? And why is the brother like an algebra teacher? And all that stuff. But maybe you can. I mean, and I want to hear you talk about that. But in relation to another question, Charles Ellenbogen asks, and this is related to what we were just talking about. Can you share your thoughts on the last image, the cup of trembling? And that relates obviously to the brother who sends a congratulatory drink of scotch and milk to his younger brother.
Right. So he sends that drink and he doesn't know if Sonny notices it, but Sonny does, and he takes it and he acknowledges it. And then it sits there. It says he sips from it and looked toward me and nodded. Then he put it back on top of the piano. For me then, as they began to play, it glowed and shook above my brother's head like the very cup of trembling. Baldwin is so well versed in the Bible and in biblical stories, and that comes from the book of Isaiah, where we're told, "Behold, I have taken out of thine hand the cup of trembling, even the dregs of the cup of my fury, thou shalt no more drink it again," right? That, for that moment, you don't have the fury and the suffering. It's trembling there. It's always there. It might come back, but it's been taken out. It's been in some ways exercised for this moment. And so that's the way I've always read that.
Well, the book of Isaiah leads us to it's a good segue to the next question,
okay.
Which is David Coslow asks, what was the reaction to Sonny's Blues by critics when it first appeared, and what has been Harold Bloom's estimation of James Baldwin's writings? And you alluded to Bloom's comparison.
So, I don't really know what the critics said when it first came out. It was a short story in the Partisan Review, so we don't get the kind of reviews that one gets from like a book review, for instance, that one could talk about the reviews. but I don't know how critics responded. It was fairly quickly, though, seen as an important work of fiction. It's, been anthologized over and over again. I mean, at one point, it was probably Baldwin's best known fiction, aside from Go Tell It on the Mountain, because it's anthologized in so many, great short stories and jazz fiction and things like that. Bloom, who has not always been kind to African-American writers, actually, I don't know what he thought of Baldwin's fiction, but of Baldwin's nonfiction, he thought that Baldwin was our great American prophet, in that that's what they both certainly understood and knew the Old Testament. And so that was high praise coming from Harold Bloom about James Baldwin. Yeah.
There's a question about the, I think it relates to the revival scene. And I wanted to ask you about that too. I mean, as you point out, that scene becomes the entry point into the beautiful final movement of the story, maybe the final chorus, we should say.
Yes.
If it's a jazz story. And, there are spirituals being sung and, spirituals in Baldwin, all the titles that he draws from spirituals, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Just Above My Head, all those. So, I mean, I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about what the spirituals meant to Baldwin and how they relate to his work. But also there's a more specific question from Antoine Mitchell. He says, what do you think Sonny's notebook was? You remember Sonny comes in from that scene carrying his notebook, or his brother spots him. A journal for his thoughts, musical notes, what do you think?
Yeah. So, I don't know. I change when I read it. I'm struck by Sonny's discipline as a musician. And, especially when he's first becoming a musician, he's listening to those chords over and over again. And so I thought, it could be ideas, it could be musical ideas, it could be transcriptions. I think about the jazz musicians, the instrumentalists, who say they learn so much from Black women vocalists. They learn phrasing from Black women's vocalists. They learn where to leave space. They learn what kind of emotion to imbue something with. Miles Davis says that he was always trying to capture the sound that he heard of a woman singing in an old country church, and if you listen to Miles with that in mind, you can actually hear it. It's like he's aspiring to get there. So I think of Sonny as doing that as well. I think that for Baldwin, he grew up hearing those spirituals and hearing those hymns. They were his songs in the night, songs that were given to get us through. He also knew that sometimes it was the language of the spirituals that really moved him, right? Just above my head. Sometimes it was the language, but more often than not, it was the sound and his interpretation of that sound, which, I think he really did believe that in the music, the aspirations, the struggles, the difficulties in the sound are all there. And that those spirituals are even pre-blues as the kind of basics that one could go back to them and find the stuff of art and find the stuff that have gotten the people through.
A cluster of questions around the brother, the narrator.
Yes.
I mean, the first thing I just would lead in by saying that, every time I read this story, I am struck, as I mentioned to you earlier, what a deep current of feeling this story rides throughout. I mean, yes. Intense, deep feeling. And I wonder, first of all, what your thoughts are about that. I mean, is it related to the familial relationships in the story, to the brothers and brotherhood, to the missing father, and then of course, it gets even more intense on the bandstand, where suddenly there's a surrogate family and there's this father figure, Creole, who, is able to guide Sonny. So I'm curious about that, but also just in terms of the family relationships more broadly. And I don't know if you think there's a biographical element feeding this, I'm curious to know. But one person asks, I'm sorry, I lost their name. Renee Bray asks, why do you think the brother isn't named?
Yeah,
and
that's
why
a great
is the
question.
story narrated by the brother? And also, finally, another question that somebody asks related to this from Gregory Dykehouse: what does it mean to learn to listen?
Okay, so I think it's fascinating that sometimes you can read the whole story and not recall until you're done that you don't know the brother's name, right? That he's not named. He's not the only unnamed figure. Sonny is one of the only named figures, Creole, but the young man who he meets on the street is the boy. The women are, they're the women. I mean, Isabel is named, the dead daughter, Grace, is named. But there are a number of people who aren't named. And I think that by not naming the narrator, there are a few things that happen. One, he can be a kind of everyman. He's the, I think he is also, he's us, he's the reader who, is literate and probably has a kind of distance from a Sonny, looks, we might even share the brother's sort of convictions and prejudgments, his judgmental nature. We might share that. And so that we then can also be transformed in the process of his own transformation. So that's the way that I've seen that. Family is, brothers appear in Baldwin's fiction over and over and over again. And one thinks even with the first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, there are two brothers. And Roy is the bad boy. He's the boy, he's the delight, the apple of the father's eye, but he's the bad boy. He's the one that doesn't follow the rules. And John, the protagonist, is the smart one, the one who probably will escape. But Baldwin does ask that question about escape. Like, I think, Max, you said it so well, like, does escape mean salvation? And it does not. And I think that one of the things that the story does so well, that the story does even better than a novel can do, because the story is short and it's like a poem almost. And that's that there is a constant tension from the very beginning. The respectable brother, the brother who has a secure job, right? He's on edge, right? And we know that there's just this tension and a kind of precarity to his life and his own sense of security as well, as he's walking to that train station where he feels the ice in his body and his veins, when he has to question, am I really helping these children? Is school teaching them anything? Maybe heroin is giving them something that school doesn't give them. So I think that feeling that you're talking about is also that feeling of being on edge, of sitting on edge.
Great. A couple follow-up questions actually to that. Our mutual friend, I think, Rafi Zafar from St. Louis, has a question. She says hi and says, how do you see Baldwin in this story and elsewhere addressing his middle-class readers, that is to say the algebra teachers? And I would, I would say, that's also a question. I mean, the story was published in Partisan Review.
Yeah.
So one thinks about that too, and who were the readers? And I don't know if there's an interesting answer to that or not, but you can talk about that. And there's a related maybe question from Franklin Freeman, who writes from Saco, Maine. He says, I remember reading Baldwin's essays and realizing, well, he's ventriloquizing Baldwin's own words, if Black people aren't free, white people aren't free. The Sonny's Blues have anything to say about that. So I think these questions both address the question of audience and like who's the story talking to in a way.
Right. Well, in giving the narrator, the algebra teacher, right? You might even be saying to a white liberal audience, this guy, here's a Black person with whom you feel comfortable, right? Maybe you know him. He might be one of your colleagues or one of your friends, and that you can then enter into this story, get access to Sonny, who you don't know, really. And you might think you think about the people in that club. He says, most of the people in that club aren't really listening, right? They really aren't. Like, there are a few people in the club who are really, really listening. And those are the ones who are going to be rewarded with that gift of transformation and freedom that many other people are not. So I think that Baldwin is always in his early work, actually talking to that audience, which might, in Fire Next Time, it's a kind of white liberal audience that he can say, if you listen, if you care, he can then interpolate you into a community that cares enough not just about Black people, but about yourselves and about the nation to do something, right? So that's what I think Baldwin's relationship to readers is at this stage in his writing. It sometimes changes later on, but now I think that's what it is.
There are a couple of questions that relate to Baldwin's vision of the future of America. Portia says, I'm interested in the fear and dread the children feel, the security that they seek from the adults. Baldwin says the story isn't new, they're just new ways of saying it. Do you think he was hopeless about the future of race relations in America? That's one question. And then a related question is, someone asks, what was his relationship with civil rights leaders? So I think maybe those two can be talked about together.
Baldwin was not hopeless. He was not ever hopeless. He was not naive or optimistic. In fact, I think he probably didn't like American optimism because it requires a feigned innocence about the reality of our lives. But he never gave in to despair. He believed that we have to go down fighting. We have to struggle to make the country that we want to live in, that we believe in. The kind of myth of optimism and innocence is what got us here in some ways. The refusal to acknowledge our past. So, at one point there's a great interview with him later in life, and he looks like this man who's forlorn, and he's seen it all, and he's disappointed, and the backlash against freedom movements is like taking its toll. And he says, he can't give in to despair because of the babies, right? Because of the children. We fight for a better future, and we fight hoping that we can make it, even knowing that it's an uphill battle, I think. It was the last part. Oh, his relationship with the civil rights leaders is very close to Medgar Evers. Had visited with Medgar Evers and was on his way home when Medgar Evers was assassinated in his driveway. He was very close to King. He helped organize the celebrities. He and Harry Belafonte helped organize the celebrities who were part of the March on Washington. He came back to the United States because of the civil rights movement, because of the desegregation battles. So he comes to prominence as a public figure, where he's on the cover of Time magazine as a spokesperson for that movement.
Thank you. We'll do we have time for like one or two more.
Okay.
Carol Dill Barkley is asking, what would you recommend readers follow up this story with next? So it's obviously, you've introduced some people to the story, and now they want to know what else to read in Baldwin and why.
So I think I know Carol Dill Barkley. That's so funny. Yeah, I think she's a beloved college classmate. It's been a while. So wow, where to begin, right? I think, for young people in particular, If Beale Street Could Talk it's a late novel. It's a very different Baldwin, but it's a beautiful novel, and it's about family and injustice and love. And I think, there's recently a very beautiful film by Barry Jenkins based on If Beale Street Could Talk. I love If Beale Street Could Talk. I think any of the short stories, Go Tell It on the Mountain is a place to start. I think once you are committed and you are, a lover of Baldwin's writing, and you're willing to stick with him through hell and high water, then read Another Country.
Thank you. I think we should end it there, and I apologize to all the people who we didn't get to their questions and comments. Thanks, Farah. That was really wonderful.
Thank you. It was wonderful for me to read this story again. I appreciate it.
So you've been listening to Farah Jasmine Griffin discuss James Baldwin's story, Sonny's Blues, published by Library of America in James Baldwin, Early Novels and Stories, edited by Toni Morrison. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. Next on Reading James Baldwin Now, on Thursday, July 16th, novelist, playwright, and essayist Darryl Pinckney discusses the 1972 essay collection, No Name in the Street, which can be found in Library of America series volume number 98, Baldwin's Collected Essays, edited by Toni Morrison. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's James Baldwin editions and links to purchase them and other volumes of Great American Writing. You'll also find video recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thank you so much again to Farah Jasmine Griffin for an inspiring evening, and everyone have a great evening.